One cry slipped through the storm that night, soft, broken, almost swallowed by the wind. But it wasn't the world that hurt her. It was the dog. Snow was falling over Duluth, thick and endless, covering every light, every road, every sin. In a small cabin at the edge of town, a weary soldier named Caleb sat awake beside his old German shepherd, Ranger, a partner forged in wars no one spoke of anymore. And then Ranger lifted his head. One sound had pierced the storm, a woman's whisper. "Please, don't let my baby die." Out there in the white wilderness, Maya, abandoned by the family that should have sheltered her, held her newborn against her chest, fading fast. No one else would have found her, but Ranger did, and what he led Caleb to that night would become the reason both man and dog finally remembered what it meant to live. Snow swept across Duluth like torn silk, the air thick with cold and silence. The town's lights glowed dim behind frosted windows, and the world seemed to hold its breath beneath the weight of another blizzard. Beyond the last row of houses, at the edge where pine trees clawed at the sky, an old cabin stood alone, its chimney thinly smoking, its porch buried under a veil of drifting white. Inside, Caleb Morgan sat by the fire, staring into the flames as if they might rewrite his past. He was 40, tall and broad-shouldered, his once black hair now streaked with gray that deepened near his temples. A trimmed beard shadowed a square jaw marked by a faint scar running from chin to cheek, a souvenir from shrapnel in Mosul. His blue-gray eyes were steady, too steady, the kind that had seen both miracles and deaths, and no longer trusted either. He wore an old flannel shirt rolled to the elbows, revealing forearms roped with muscle and burn marks that had long lost their sting. In that silence, only one other sound existed, the slow, even breathing of Ranger, a 10-year-old German shepherd stretched across the wooden floor near the hearth. The dog's coat was a mix of dark mahogany and black, glossy despite the years. A faint white stripe ran down his muzzle, giving him a look both noble and weary. He was aging, his right hind leg stiff from an old wound, yet his eyes were sharp amber, watchful, loyal, and forever listening. Caleb often said Ranger heard ghosts long before men did. Tonight, as the wind howled outside, the dog lifted his head suddenly. His ears twitched, nose tilting toward the door. Caleb noticed the shift. "What is it, boy?" he murmured, voice low and rough like gravel under snow. Ranger didn't bark. He only stood, alert, tail frozen midair. The sound came again, barely a whisper beneath the storm, fragile, human. Caleb's hand paused over his coffee mug. He heard it now, too, a cry that wasn't quite a cry. Faint, desperate. A woman's voice carried by the wind, cracking with fear and something deeper. "Please, don't let my baby die." Caleb froze. Every instinct from the battlefield, every reflex born of chaos, came alive. Without another word, he grabbed his coat from the rack, shoved his feet into boots, and opened the door. The cold struck like a blade. Ranger shot forward into the white. Caleb followed, flashlight cutting through a blur of swirling snow. Duluth's outer roads were almost invisible, fences and rooftops buried deep, power lines sagging. His breath turned to shards in the air. The wind screamed louder as he descended the hill behind his cabin. Ranger's paw prints led him toward the edge of the woods, then veered left, down a narrow street where abandoned houses leaned like broken bones. One window flickered, a dying porch light. Beneath it, a shape slumped against the doorway. A woman. Maya. Her body curled protectively around a bundle of cloth pressed to her chest. She looked no older than 30. Snow clung to her hair, once chestnut, now matted and wet, her pale face streaked with tears and cold burns. She wore a thin gray dress under a black wool coat that was torn at one sleeve. Her lips were cracked, her hands trembling as she whispered again to the child in her arms. Caleb knelt beside her, brushing snow from her cheek. "Hey, you hear me? You're safe now." Her eyes fluttered open, hazel, wide and glassy. She blinked as if unsure whether the man crouched before her was real or just another dream conjured by exhaustion. "He's cold," she rasped. "Please, my baby." Caleb's heartbeat quickened. He pulled back the blanket slightly and saw a newborn, wrapped tight, face ghostly but breathing faintly. No more than a few days old. "We're getting you both out of here," he said, his voice firm now, commanding but gentle. He took off his coat, wrapping it around them, and lifted Maya into his arms. She was light. Too light. Ranger trotted beside him, pressing close to keep them steady against the wind. Every step uphill was a battle. The snow was knee-deep, the world white and endless. But Caleb's breath came from something more than lungs. It came from will. When he finally reached the cabin, Ranger scratched the door until it swung open. Caleb laid Maya on the couch near the fire, the baby still clutched against her. He worked fast. Blankets, warm water bottles, the old kettle on the stove. He rubbed the baby's tiny hands, feeling for life. Maya stirred weakly, eyes following his movements. Why are you helping me?" she asked, her voice breaking. Caleb didn't look up. Because someone should have. Ranger lay at her feet, tail thumping once, then resting again. When warmth finally touched her skin, she sobbed quietly, not from pain, but from disbelief that someone had stopped long enough to see her. Caleb watched in silence. Something inside him, something he thought had died with his daughter 5 years ago, shifted slightly, painfully. Her name had been Ella. Leukemia. 7 months between diagnosis and goodbye. His wife couldn't bear it. She left a note on the kitchen table the morning after the funeral. "I can't live beside ghosts, Caleb." Since then, silence had been his only companion, until tonight. He looked at Maya, at the baby pressed against her chest, and felt the weight of survival hanging between them. "You've been out there long?" he asked quietly. She nodded faintly. "Since the funeral. They didn't want me. Said I was bad luck." Her voice cracked again. "My husband, he died working for them. They said I brought it." She didn't have to say who they were. Caleb knew the type. Rich, untouchable, cruel in ways that never left marks on their own skin. He sat back, rubbing his hands over his face, the firelight tracing every line of fatigue carved deep into him. Ranger shifted closer to the couch, resting his head against the edge, eyes soft. The baby whimpered, a thin sound that made the room's air tremble. Caleb handed Maya a cup of warm water. She took it with both hands, sipping carefully, watching him over the rim. "You're a soldier," she said suddenly. It wasn't a question. He nodded. Was. Now just a man trying to stay out of the world's way. Her lips trembled into a faint, grateful smile. "Then maybe the world sent you back for me." The words were barely louder than the fire's crackle, but they reached him. For a long time Caleb said nothing. Then he reached over, pulled the blanket higher around her and the child, and whispered, "Sleep. We'll talk when it's light." As she drifted into exhaustion, he sat in the chair across from her, Ranger between them, the dog's gaze fixed on the window as if guarding against the storm itself. Outside, the snow kept falling, relentless, soft, and merciless. Inside, 3 lost souls shared the first warmth they'd known in years. Caleb looked at the baby, then at the woman's tired face, and felt an ache he hadn't allowed himself in a long time, the ache of beginning to care again. Morning came slowly to Duluth, pale light creeping across the snow like a hesitant promise. Inside the cabin, the fire had burned low, but still glowed faintly, breathing warmth into the wooden walls. Caleb stood by the window, mug in hand, watching the trees sway under the lingering wind. His body still carried the ache of the night before, his shoulders stiff, his eyes raw from sleeplessness. Yet for the first time in months, he wasn't alone with the silence. Behind him, the soft cry of a newborn cut through the air, thin but alive. Maya stirred on the couch, her face no longer as pale as the night he found her. Her hazel eyes opened slowly, confusion and fear flickering across them before memory settled in. She looked around the small cabin, the shelves lined with books and military medals, the smell of burning pine, and the dog lying near the hearth like a sentry of peace. Ranger lifted his head, ears twitching, tail brushing the floor once in acknowledgement. Caleb set his mug down and turned toward her. "You're safe here," he said quietly. "Storm's easing." She tried to sit up, but the motion made her wince. Caleb stepped forward to help, steadying her shoulders. Her fingers brushed against his, and for a heartbeat, they both froze. She whispered, "Thank you."
"Don't thank me," he replied softly. "Just rest. You've been through hell."
Her gaze fell to the small bundle in her arms. "His name is Noah," she murmured. The baby squirmed, letting out a soft, sleepy sigh. Caleb smiled faintly. "That's a good name." "Strong." Maya looked back at him. "I didn't even know where I was going last night. Just kept walking. They locked me out after the funeral." Her voice trembled, anger and shame mixing like oil and water. Caleb didn't interrupt. He knew what it meant to have nowhere to go, to be unwanted by the world that once called you its own. She reached for the bag that lay beside the couch. "There's something I need to show you." From the worn leather satchel, she pulled out a small wooden box with a brass latch. It was old and scarred, with initials faintly engraved on the lid. J.M., her husband's. When she opened it, inside lay a folded envelope, a few old photographs, and a silver chain with a bent wedding ring threaded through. Caleb's eyes drifted to the photos first. One of Maya and a man standing in front of a barn, both smiling awkwardly. Another of him in a mechanic's uniform beside a black truck bearing the Miller family logo. "He worked for them," she said quietly, fingers tightening around the edge of the box. "They said it was an accident. That he fell asleep at the wheel. But that's a lie. He told me the night before that he was scared. He said someone was threatening him because he knew too much about how they ran their business." Caleb crouched beside the couch, his brow furrowing. "What kind of business?" "Real estate, mostly. But they launder money through it. Everyone in town knows, but no one says anything. The Millers own half of Duluth. They owned him, too." Her eyes burned as tears slipped down her cheeks. "When he died, they paid for the funeral, but afterward they told me to leave their house. Said I brought shame, that the baby wasn't welcome." Caleb's jaw tightened. He had seen this kind of cruelty before, not on the battlefield, but in the quiet wars people waged at home. He looked down at the photographs again. One caught his attention, a man in a suit shaking her husband's hand. His face was sharp, controlled, eyes like frozen steel. "That's one of them?" She nodded. "Richard Miller, the oldest son. He runs the company now." Caleb's memory stirred. He'd seen the name before, years ago, in a newspaper about a corruption case that never reached court. Money had changed hands. The story disappeared. Maya's voice broke his thoughts. "I know I shouldn't drag you into this. You've done enough." Caleb shook his head slowly. "You didn't drag me anywhere. I followed a cry for help, and I'm not turning away now." Ranger stood, stretched, and walked over to Maya's side, resting his head gently on her knee. She smiled faintly, her trembling hand brushing over the dog's fur. "He's gentle," she whispered. Only when he wants to be, Caleb said, a hint of warmth in his tone. He's 10 now. We served together in Iraq, found survivors in the rubble once, after a hospital bombing. He never gave up, even when I thought we were done for. Maya's eyes softened. He saved lives then, and now he saved mine. The words struck Caleb deeper than she knew. He looked away, clearing his throat. You should eat something. There's soup on the stove. As she sipped the broth slowly, color returned to her face. She looked around the cabin again, the worn furniture, the cracked clock on the mantel, the faint hum of the wind pressing against the glass. It's quiet here, she said. That's the point, he replied. Too much noise out there. I needed somewhere. The world couldn't find me. Did it work? She asked softly. Caleb gave a humorless smile. For a while. The silence that followed was heavy but not uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people who recognized pain in each other without needing to name it. Later that day, a knock came at the door, a sharp, polite rhythm that didn't belong to a stranger. Caleb opened it to find Sarah Jennings, his nearest neighbor, standing there with a basket in her hands. She was in her mid-50s, tall and thin with a frame hardened by farm work. Her silver blonde hair was tied back in a braid under a wool cap. Deep lines framed her kind eyes, the kind that had seen too much grief but refused to turn bitter. Well, I'll be, she said, stepping inside and brushing snow off her coat. I figured you'd gone all winter without letting a soul in, and now I find you playing nurse. Caleb smirked. She and her baby needed help. That's all. Sarah's gaze softened as she looked at Maya. You poor thing. You look like you've been through the ringer. Her voice carried warmth and gentle authority. She set the basket on the table. Soup and bread. You'll need it. Thank you, Maya said, her voice trembling slightly. Sarah gave her a reassuring pat on the shoulder before turning back to Caleb. You know this'll get tongues wagging, don't you? A widow and a soldier living under one roof? Caleb exhaled. Let them talk. Sarah smiled faintly. That's what I figured you'd say. She looked down at Ranger. Still keeping him on kitchen duty? Ranger wagged his tail and she chuckled. Good boy. Smarter than most men I know. When she left, the cabin felt warmer than before. Outside, the storm had eased, the first sunlight of the week spilling through the windows like forgiveness. Maya sat quietly, rocking Noah, while Caleb fed logs to the fire. For the first time she smiled. Small, fragile, but real. Caleb caught the look and returned it without words. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was something new. 3 lives, once broken in different ways, were beginning to find their shape again. The third morning after the storm broke with a silence that felt heavier than snow. Duluth was wrapped in white stillness, the kind that swallowed sound and made every movement sacred. Caleb stood outside his cabin, breath forming pale ghosts in the air, as Ranger nosed around the path leading toward the tree line. The old dog's tail flicked slowly, his paws pressing faint prints into the powder. Caleb's thoughts were distant, trapped between the present and the fragments Maya had whispered to him the night before. Inside, the fire cracked, throwing light across the small wooden walls. Maya sat at the kitchen table, her hair damp from washing, tied loosely at the nape of her neck. Her face still carried the fragility of exhaustion, but something had changed. The fear that once owned her eyes now shared space with determination. Her hands shook slightly as she spread the photographs on the table. One was torn clean down the middle, showing half of a man's smile and the edge of a truck behind him. Caleb entered, wiping snow from his boots. You didn't sleep. I couldn't, Maya replied, voice quiet but clear. I keep thinking about that night. About what he said before he left. She reached for the torn photo, her fingers trembling. He told me he was going to meet someone to settle a debt. Said if he didn't come back, to look in his phone. But the police said they found nothing. Caleb's brow furrowed. Did they return it to you? No, they said it was never recovered, but I know he had it with him. He never went anywhere without that phone. It had everything. Ranger, sensing the tension, padded over and rested his head on her lap. She smiled faintly and ran her hand through his coarse fur. Caleb watched them for a moment, then spoke. If it's out there, we'll find it. Maya looked up, surprised. You mean it? He nodded. I've searched worse places for less reason. She studied him. You've lost people too, haven't you? Caleb didn't answer immediately. He looked toward the window where the world beyond glowed in cold light. Yeah, he said finally, more than I can count. That afternoon, Caleb made a call from the old landline that hung crookedly near the fireplace. His voice softened slightly when the line clicked open. Gabe? It's Morgan. On the other end, a rough laugh came through the static. Gabriel Gabe Foster was a man Caleb had served with 15 years ago. Now 45, Gabe worked maintenance at the local VA clinic. He was short and broad with a thick beard and one eye clouded by an old injury. People said he'd been hit by shrapnel during a convoy ambush, but Gabe called it his weather eye. It hurt before every storm. Morgan, you old ghost, Gabe said. Didn't think you remembered how to use a phone. I need a favor, Caleb replied. Quiet one. Gabe chuckled. Aren't they all? Within an hour, Gabe drove out in his battered Ford pickup, the sound of the engine echoing through the frozen valley. When he stepped inside, the warmth hit him like a wall. He took off his gloves, revealing thick fingers covered in scars, and nodded at Maya. You must be the one causing the trouble. Caleb never calls unless something's broken. Maya gave a nervous smile. I didn't mean to. Gabe raised a hand. No blame, miss. Just truth. What are we hunting? Caleb laid the torn photo on the table. A phone. His husband's. Might have been dumped somewhere near the Miller property. Gabe whistled low. The Millers, huh? That nest of snakes still biting people? They don't just bite, Caleb said grimly. They bury. The three of them planned while Ranger slept near the door, one ear twitching at every sound. By dusk, the plan was set. They'd start near the frozen creek that bordered the Miller estate, a place thick with ice and cattails. Caleb suspected someone had tossed the phone there to get rid of evidence. When night came, the temperature dropped sharply. Maya insisted on going along despite Caleb's protest. She wore a thick parka and snow boots Gabe had brought, the coat too big for her frame. Caleb couldn't refuse her determination. Ranger led the way, nose low, body tense. They followed the trail through the pines, their flashlights slicing through the fog of their breath. At the creek's edge, Ranger stopped, sniffing the air. His paw scraped at the ice, claws catching something beneath. Caleb crouched beside him. Easy, boy. He brushed away snow and saw it, a glint of black plastic caught under a thin crust of ice. A phone. He used the butt of his knife to break it free. The case was cracked, the screen shattered, but when he pressed the side button, a faint vibration hummed. Still alive. Maya gasped softly. Back in the cabin, Gabe pried it open with the precision of an old mechanic. Lucky, he muttered. The battery's half gone, but the SIM card's dry. He plugged it into his repair kit, the small screen flickering to life. Caleb stood behind him, arms folded, eyes narrowing as text messages appeared. The final thread of conversation made his stomach twist. It was between her husband, James Miller's financial manager, and a local attorney named Peter Langford. The messages were blunt. Keep quiet about the transfers, and your debt's gone. Then another. You talk. You disappear like the last one. The final message timestamp matched the night of the accident. Maya's breath hitched. They killed him. Caleb placed a hand on her shoulder, steadying her. We don't have proof of that yet, but this is a start. Gabe leaned back, rubbing his beard. Peter Langford. I've seen that name. Works downtown. Big smile, small soul. You sure you want to go up against him?" Caleb's expression hardened. "I'm sure. He's tied to the Millers, and this," he tapped the screen, "is enough to make noise." Ranger barked once, sharp and sudden, as if agreeing. Maya looked at the dog, her voice trembling but firm. "They took everything from me. My husband, my home. I can't let them take my son's future too." Caleb met her gaze and nodded slowly. "Then we'll make them answer for it." Outside, the wind rose again, sweeping against the cabin walls. The storm wasn't gone. It had only paused, waiting for its next breath. Inside, Caleb and Maya sat in the flickering light, the broken phone between them. The truth was surfacing piece by piece, like torn pictures finally being taped back together. Caleb stared at the evidence, at the faint reflection of his face on the cracked screen, and realized this wasn't just her fight anymore. The war had followed him home. It had simply changed its uniform. The snow had hardened into a crust by the following evening, the kind that cracked under boots and reflected light like shattered glass. The cabin at the edge of Duluth stood quiet beneath the bruised sky, its chimney whispering thin smoke into the night. Inside, the fire burned low, but unease hung thicker than the scent of pine. Caleb sat by the table, eyes fixed on the broken phone lying between him and Maya. The faint glow of the fire flickered across his scarred face, tracing the lines of thought buried deep. Maya was rocking Noah near the hearth, the baby's soft breaths blended with the sound of crackling wood. Her hair, now clean and brushed, shone chestnut under the firelight, though her cheeks were pale with tension. She looked fragile still, but the hollow fear in her eyes had turned to a quiet defiance. She knew danger was coming. Caleb noticed her silence. "You're thinking about them again." She nodded, voice low. "They'll come." "They always do when someone doesn't disappear properly." Before Caleb could answer, Ranger lifted his head, ears pricking. The German shepherd's body stiffened, tail low, eyes sharp. Caleb followed his gaze toward the door. The wind outside had gone still, too still. Then came the sound, the crunch of footsteps on snow, slow, deliberate. Caleb stood, motioning Maya to stay back. He moved to the window and peered through the frost. Two dark figures approached, their silhouettes framed by the moonlight. One held a flashlight that danced across the frozen ground. The other carried something metallic, glinting faintly. "Stay with the baby," Caleb whispered. He reached behind the door, pulling out a heavy wrench. His old habit of keeping something solid within reach never left him. Ranger was already by his side, silent, a soldier once more. The knock came hard, impatient. A voice followed, low, male, smooth in that way men sound when they think they're in control. "Evening, Mr. Morgan. Sheriff's office. We just need to ask a few questions about a missing woman." Caleb didn't move. He'd known enough liars in uniform to hear deceit in tone. The voice was too casual, the pause too long after sheriff's office. "Go away," he said evenly. "You've got the wrong place." The next sound was metal on wood, someone trying the handle. The door shuddered. Ranger growled deep in his chest. The baby started crying. Maya clutched Noah tighter, fear flashing across her face. Then the lock snapped. The door burst open, cold air rushing in like a living thing. Two men stepped through. The first was tall, broad, and bald, dressed in a dark overcoat over flannel. His face was clean-shaven, but a scar split his chin like a seam. His companion was slimmer, with a narrow face and thin blonde hair slicked back with oil, his eyes restless and calculating. Caleb's muscles tensed. He recognized the type immediately. Mercenaries, not officers. "You should have knocked softer," he said. The bald man grinned, showing uneven teeth. "We don't do polite. Lady owes people answers." "Not tonight," Caleb said. The man lunged. Caleb sidestepped, slammed the wrench across his arm, hearing bone crack. The second swung a metal rod, grazing Caleb's shoulder. Ranger barked, a sound so loud and deep it filled the cabin. The dog launched forward, teeth flashing, biting down on the thin man's wrist. The attacker screamed, stumbling backward. Maya crouched low behind the couch, shielding Noah beneath her coat. Fear pulsed through her veins, but her eyes didn't close. She watched as Caleb moved like he had in another life, precise, controlled, brutal when needed. The bald man recovered, drawing a pistol from under his coat. Caleb froze for half a heartbeat, then dove to the side as a shot cracked through the air. Wood splintered, glass shattered, and the baby wailed. Ranger, growling fiercely, lunged again, knocking the man's hand aside. The gun went off, grazing the dog's flank. "Ranger!" Caleb shouted. The shepherd didn't stop. He hit the man squarely, teeth catching fabric and flesh. Caleb seized the chance, punching the second man square in the jaw, sending him sprawling against the stove. The fight ended as abruptly as it began. The bald man, bleeding from his forearm and shoulder, scrambled for the door. "This isn't over," he spat before stumbling into the night, dragging his partner behind him. For a moment, only the sound of heavy breathing and the wind returned. Caleb knelt beside Ranger, checking the wound. The dog whimpered softly but stayed still. The bullet had grazed skin, no deeper than a scratch. Caleb exhaled. "You're fine, boy. Tougher than all of us." Maya was trembling when he turned to her. Her lips were pale, but she managed to speak. "They knew my name." Caleb nodded grimly. "Which means they'll come again. We need help." That night, he made another call, this time to a number he hadn't dialed in years. The voice that answered was calm, gravelly, and unmistakably firm. Detective Aaron Blake, late 50s, retired but still sharp. He had been a field investigator before politics pushed him out. Caleb had served beside him once on a veteran's assistance case. "Blake speaking." "It's Morgan. I've got something ugly up here in Duluth. Need your eyes on it." Blake sighed on the other end, the sound of paper rustling faintly. "You always did call when the devils were out." "They came after a woman and her baby. Said it was legal business. I don't buy it." "Send me what you've got," Blake said. "I'll dig through old contacts, see who's still got pull in the department. Keep her safe." By morning, the attack had already drawn attention. Sarah Jennings arrived with supplies and news, her silver braid undone by the wind. "Two men in black coats were seen heading toward town," she said, frowning. "Folks are whispering already. They say the Millers are back to their old tricks." Maya looked up sharply. "People know?" Sarah nodded. "They do now. Word spreads faster than frost around here." Later that day, a knock came again, this time gentle. A man stood in the doorway holding a notepad and a camera bag slung over one shoulder. He looked around 35, clean-shaven, with dark hair that curled slightly beneath a wool cap. His name was Evan Reed, a local journalist for the Duluth Chronicle. His eyes were sharp with curiosity, the kind that missed nothing. "Mr. Morgan," he said politely, "I'm writing about a recent break-in near this area. Mind if I ask a few questions?" Caleb hesitated. Maya tensed, clutching Noah close. Evan raised his hand slightly. "Look, I'm not here to cause trouble. But the Millers. People are saying they're cleaning up something they shouldn't. If that's true, folks deserve to know." Caleb exchanged a glance with Maya, then opened the door wider. "Come in. You might get more than you bargained for." As Evan stepped inside, the firelight caught his notepad, where the words "Miller case, corruption" were already underlined twice. Outside, the cold deepened, but inside, the flame burned stronger than it had since the war, an ember of truth rising beneath layers of ice. The morning sun rose weakly over Duluth, its pale light glinting off a frozen world that had seen too much silence. Inside the cabin, Caleb sat at the table surrounded by papers, printouts, and a web of notes. The air smelled of coffee and exhaustion. Ranger lay curled by the stove, his bandaged flank rising and falling with slow, steady breaths. The German shepherd looked older that morning, though his eyes still burned with a soldier's resolve. Across from Caleb, Maya leaned forward, clutching the phone they'd recovered from the creek. Her hair was tied back in a messy braid, a few strands falling across her tired face. There was no fear left in her expression, only focus, sharpened by grief and purpose. Evan Reed, the young journalist, sat beside her, flipping through his notebook. His clean-shaven face looked drawn from sleepless nights, his dark eyes bright with restless energy. He had the look of a man who'd finally found a story worth risking everything for. Caleb's voice broke the quiet. "These messages," he said, tapping the table, "they're enough to make noise, but not to convict. We need something solid, something that ties them directly to her husband's death." Evan nodded. "Then we dig. Someone saw something. People always do." Sarah Jennings arrived later that morning, her cheeks red from the cold, a scarf wrapped tight around her neck. She carried a basket of bread and, more importantly, news. "I heard talk down at the post office," she said, brushing snow from her shoulders. "Old Mrs. Cooper says one of the Miller trucks was parked near the bridge the night James died. She lives 2 houses down from the river road." Maya's eyes widened. "She saw them?" Sarah nodded grimly. "Didn't say much before. Too scared. But I reckon she might talk now, seeing what's happened." Caleb glanced at Evan. "You think she'll go on record?" Evan smiled wryly. "If she doesn't, I'll make sure her voice still reaches the paper." That afternoon they drove to Lillian Cooper's small house on the edge of town. The woman was in her 70s, small and bent but with eyes sharp as frost. Her hair was white and tied back neatly. Her hands trembled as she poured them tea, but her voice carried the strength of someone who'd lived too long to fear the truth. "I saw it from my porch," she said, her gaze distant. "That night was cold as death. I remember because my pipes froze. The Miller truck stopped by the bridge around midnight. 2 men got out. One tall, one heavy set. They opened the back, took something heavy out, and threw it into the creek. I thought it was garbage until I heard the news next morning." Maya clutched her coat tighter. "You're sure it was theirs?" The old woman nodded slowly. "I'd bet my life on it. That truck's been making rounds for years. Belonged to their property manager, Jameson Pike." Caleb's jaw tensed. "That's our man." Jameson Pike, mid-40s, balding, tall, always seen in pressed suits and expensive coats. A man who wore charm like armor. Caleb remembered him faintly from town meetings years ago, his smooth voice and practiced smile. Behind that veneer lay something colder, something that turned power into cruelty. Back at the cabin, Caleb called Aaron Blake, his old investigator friend. The older man's voice crackled through the line. "So you've got a witness." "Good. I've been digging too. Langford and Pike made several wire transfers through a dummy account 2 days before the crash. That's not coincidence." Caleb's tone hardened. "You can trace it?" "Already did," Blake said. "Sending you the report. But listen, Morgan, the moment you go public, they'll come for her again. Be ready." Caleb looked toward Maya, who sat rocking her son by the fire. Her face was calm now, almost serene, as if the storm had finally aligned with her purpose. "We're already past the point of turning back," he said. That night, Evan prepared the article. He sat at the wooden desk, typing fast, the only sound in the room the rhythmic clack of keys. Caleb read over his shoulder as words took shape. Headlines that would shake Duluth awake. Corruption in the snow. Miller family under fire after new evidence in worker's death. The story cited text messages, financial records, and the witness testimony of Lillian Cooper. It included Langford's threats and Caleb's account of the assault. Evan's voice trembled slightly when he spoke. Once this goes live, there's no taking it back. Maya looked at him, her hazel eyes steady. Good. Let them see what they've done. By dawn, the article was published online. Within hours, the story spread through town like a spark across dry fields. Local radio picked it up. People began whispering names again. The Millers, Pike, Langford. Silence had finally broken. Later that day, police cars rolled through the snow toward the Miller estate. Reporters followed, cameras flashing as uniformed officers crossed the gated driveway. At the cabin, Caleb watched the news unfold on an old television with a shaky signal. Pike was being led away in handcuffs, shouting protests. Langford followed soon after, his face pale, his slick hair disheveled. Evan smiled faintly. You just brought down the biggest family in Duluth. Caleb shook his head. No, she did. Maya was standing by the window, Noah in her arms. The baby was asleep, his tiny hand curled around her finger. Her eyes shimmered with something between relief and sorrow. He can rest now, she whispered. James can finally rest. But the fight wasn't over yet. That afternoon, Caleb and Maya were summoned to the courthouse for the preliminary hearing. The building loomed gray and solemn against the snow. Inside, the air smelled of paper and old justice. Reporters lined the hallway as Caleb led Maya through the crowd, Ranger walking close by, his bandaged side healing but his step still proud. In the courtroom, Jameson Pike and Peter Langford sat at the defense table, both avoiding Maya's gaze. The prosecutor read the charges: fraud, conspiracy, obstruction, and endangerment. When Lillian Cooper took the stand, her trembling hands didn't hide her steel. I saw what they did, she told the court. They dumped that phone and laughed while doing it. I kept quiet because I was afraid. But not anymore. Langford shifted uncomfortably, whispering to his lawyer. Pike glared, but his confidence was fading. The judge's gavel struck once, echoing through the chamber. The court finds sufficient cause to proceed with indictment. Outside, as they left the courthouse, snow began to fall again. Soft, slow, almost forgiving. Reporters surrounded them, but Caleb shielded Maya with his arm. Evan's camera caught the moment. A soldier, a mother, a dog, and a newborn framed against the snowfall. The story that had started with a whisper was now echoing through every home in Duluth. That night, when the cabin lights dimmed, Caleb sat by the window watching the world quiet down. The storm had lifted, but something deeper remained. A sense that justice, once frozen, was finally beginning to thaw. The weeks that followed the trial passed like the slow melting of ice, quiet, patient, and full of new light. Duluth was thawing. Snow still crowned the rooftops, but the streets began to breathe again, streams whispering under bridges as the frost gave way. In the cabin at the edge of the woods, life was no longer ruled by fear. It was ruled by the sound of a baby's laughter. Maya sat by the window, sunlight spilling across her lap as she held Noah close. Her cheeks glowed with returning color. Her hair, once dull and tangled, now caught the light in chestnut waves. There was peace in her face, though sometimes, when silence fell, a shadow crossed her eyes, the kind that grief leaves behind even after healing begins. She hummed softly to her son, a lullaby her husband used to sing. Caleb watched from the doorway, a faint smile touching his lips. He wore a thick wool sweater instead of his usual flannel, his beard trimmed, his eyes lighter than they had been in years. The scars on his hands were still there, but they had lost their anger. Ranger lay on the rug between them, head resting on his paws, one ear twitching as he dreamed. A faint scar ran along his side now, a reminder of the night he'd faced danger again for the people he loved. Caleb spoke quietly. He's getting soft, you know. Doesn't even bark at the mail truck anymore. Maya laughed, a sound that filled the cabin with warmth. Maybe he's just tired of fighting. Caleb's smile deepened. Aren't we all? They shared a silence that wasn't empty but full, the kind that carries understanding without the need for words. Outside, wind moved through the pines, carrying the smell of spring. Over the next days, Maya began walking into town again. People who once whispered behind her back now greeted her with cautious smiles. The story that Evan Reed had written had changed everything. Justice, long delayed, had finally reached the Miller estate. Jameson Pike was in prison awaiting trial, and Peter Langford's law license had been revoked. The remaining members of the Miller family, shamed and stripped of power, retreated from public life. One morning, Evan stopped by the cabin. He looked more relaxed than before, his dark hair windswept, camera slung over his shoulder. Thought I'd check in on my favorite headline, he joked as Caleb opened the door. Inside, Evan knelt beside the baby's crib. He's grown, he said softly. Looks just like his mom. Maya smiled. He's calmer than she ever was. Evan chuckled. That's debatable. You've made quite the home here. He paused, his expression softening. The Chronicle is running a follow-up piece. About recovery, not tragedy this time. I'd like to feature you both, if you're okay with that. Caleb hesitated, then nodded. If it helps someone else, do it. When Evan left, Maya turned to Caleb. Do you really think people will care? He met her eyes. I think people always care when hope shows up where no one expects it. As weeks turned into months, their lives began to intertwine naturally. Maya cooked while Caleb worked in the yard, repairing the old fence, fixing the roof with patient hands. At night, they'd sit on the porch, wrapped in blankets, watching the stars burn through the clear Minnesota sky. Sometimes she'd tell him stories of her childhood, of summers by the lake, her first piano recital, the night she met her husband. And sometimes he'd tell her about his daughter, Ella. He spoke her name now without breaking. One evening while Maya was feeding Noah, she looked up and found Caleb watching her with quiet awe. She blushed, smiling shyly. What? He shook his head. Nothing. Just haven't seen that kind of peace in a long time. She looked down at Noah. He's my reason to keep breathing. Then she glanced back at him. You are too, you know. The words hung in the air, delicate but certain. Caleb's heart tightened. He hadn't felt that kind of warmth since before the war. Maya, he said softly, you don't owe me anything. I know, she whispered. That's what makes it real. Ranger barked once, as if to break the tension, tail thumping against the floor. They both laughed, and for a moment it felt like the world had righted itself. By early summer, Maya had an idea. I want to start something, she told Caleb as they walked through town. A place for women who've been left behind. Not a shelter exactly, something smaller, a circle, where they can talk, learn, rebuild. Caleb looked at her, thoughtful. You mean like a support group? She nodded eagerly. Exactly. Maybe we can use part of the church basement. Pastor Hale said they never use it midweek. Pastor Hale was a gentleman in his 60s, short with thinning hair and a perpetual kindness in his eyes. He had been one of the few who stood up for Maya after the truth came out. When they approached him about the idea, he clasped her hands warmly. If your story can bring light to others, then the door will always be open, he said. The first meeting took place on a Wednesday afternoon. 5 women came, widows, single mothers, one young girl barely 20 with bruises on her arms that she tried to hide. They spoke quietly at first, their words halting, afraid. But Maya told her story, every part of it, from the night she was cast out to the night she was found in the snow. She didn't cry. She didn't need to. Her voice carried both the pain and the proof of survival. When she finished, silence filled the room. Then one woman, her eyes red, whispered, You give me hope! After that, the the room changed. The women spoke freely. There was laughter, there were tears, and for the first time, Maya felt something inside her click into place. That evening when she returned home, Caleb was repairing a chair outside. Ranger rested nearby, his muzzle graying, eyes watchful. She told him everything, and he listened, nodding slowly. "You did good," he said simply. Maya smiled. "No, we did." As the sun sank behind the trees, golden light spilled over the yard. Caleb reached down to pat Ranger's head. The dog sighed contentedly, pressing close to his hand. "You old hero," Caleb murmured. "You're the reason any of this happened." Inside the cabin, Noah let out a soft laugh, a sound that broke into the quiet evening like a bell of pure joy. Caleb and Maya turned toward it at the same time and smiled. In that sound, light, fleeting, miraculous, they found everything they thought they'd lost: peace, love, and the courage to begin again. Spring came quietly to Duluth that year, not with trumpets of color, but with slow, patient warmth. The snow melted into trickling streams that whispered through the trees, and for the first time in many months, sunlight stretched long and golden over the cabin by the edge of the woods. The air smelled of pine and thawing earth. Inside, laughter, small, human, ordinary, filled the rooms that had once known only silence. Caleb stood on the porch, sleeves rolled up, sanding the railing. The man who had once looked like a ghost of war now looked alive. His hair was still streaked with gray, but his eyes were lighter, touched with something new: peace. His build remained strong, broad-shouldered, and his face, though marked by scars and the faint line of an old burn across his jaw, carried a softness that came from rediscovering purpose. Behind him, the door creaked open and Maya stepped out holding Noah in her arms. She wore a pale blue dress, simple but radiant in the morning light. Her brown hair fell loose over her shoulders, catching the breeze, and her cheeks carried a glow that no longer came from survival, but from living. The baby squirmed against her chest, chubby fingers reaching toward the sunlight. "He keeps wanting to chase the light," she said with a smile. Caleb chuckled, brushing the sawdust from his hands. "Can't blame him. He's his mother's son." Her laugh came easy now, full and musical, and for a moment the world felt suspended in that sound. Ranger stirred on the porch beside them. The old German shepherd lifted his head, his muzzle now mostly silver. His once powerful frame had grown leaner with age, but the intelligence in his amber eyes burned as fiercely as ever. He blinked up at Caleb, tail thumping once. "Still watching over us, huh, old boy?" Caleb said, kneeling beside him. Ranger leaned into his hand, a low hum of contentment rumbling in his chest. The scar on his flank had faded into a pale streak under his fur, a small badge of courage that everyone in Duluth seemed to know about now. By late afternoon, the cabin was alive with preparation. Maya arranged flowers in mismatched jars along the wooden table, while Caleb and Sarah Jennings set up folding chairs outside. Sarah, tall, strong-shouldered, with streaks of silver woven into her honey-blonde hair, moved briskly despite her age. She was the kind of woman whose presence steadied a room, who'd carried others' burdens long before they ever asked. Her voice carried across the yard. "If you keep that fire too strong, Caleb, you'll roast us before the guests arrive." Caleb grinned. "Just trying to make sure people stay warm." Minnesota doesn't forgive anyone who underestimates her evenings. Sarah laughed, swatting at him with her glove. "You always were stubborn as the wind." By 6, the first guests arrived. Evan Reed, the journalist, came with his camera slung over his shoulder and a pie in his hands. "I figured if I'm going to invade your privacy again, I should at least bring dessert," he joked. Behind him came Pastor Hale, short and round as ever, his kind blue eyes crinkled in delight. "You see, Mr. Morgan," he said, patting Caleb's arm, "miracles do come to those who believe, and occasionally to those who fight like hell for them." They laughed, and the evening unfolded gently. The small yard filled with neighbors, women from Maya's support circle, children chasing one another between the trees, the hum of life weaving through the cool air. The table was crowded with food: Sarah's roasted chicken, Pastor Hale's bread, Maya's apple pie, and Caleb's simple but hearty stew. The fire pit glowed softly, and above them the first stars began to appear. As the night deepened, Evan lifted his camera, capturing moments quietly: the soldier smiling, the woman holding her child, the dog resting near the firelight. He didn't stage a single photo. He didn't need to. Some stories didn't need headlines anymore. Later, when the crowd thinned, Maya found Caleb standing near the tree line, watching the sky fade into navy blue. She walked to him, the baby asleep in her arms. "You've been quiet tonight," she said softly. He nodded. "Just thinking." "About?" He turned to face her, the firelight dancing across his features. "About how strange life is. How something broken can still be made into something worth keeping." His gaze moved to her, gentle and certain. "You and Noah, you gave me back a reason to stay." Maya's lips curved into a tender smile. "And you gave us a reason to believe again." She reached up, brushing her fingers against his cheek. He leaned into her touch without hesitation this time. There was no rush, no grand confession, only two people who had weathered too many storms finding warmth in one another's presence. Ranger, lying a few feet away, lifted his head briefly as if to approve before settling down again with a sigh. The fire crackled, sending sparks into the air that drifted upward like tiny stars. From the porch, Sarah's laughter carried faintly as she said goodnight to the last guests. Evan waved from the driveway, promising to drop off the photos next week. Pastor Hale called out a blessing before he disappeared into the dark, his voice lingering like a hymn. When the night finally grew still, Caleb and Maya stood together by the fire, Noah sleeping peacefully between them. The snow that once buried their past had melted into soil, and from it, something new had begun to grow. Caleb looked down at the baby, then at Maya. "You know," he said quietly, "I used to think soldiers were only meant to fight battles. Turns out some of us were meant to build homes." Maya's eyes glistened. "And some of us were meant to find you there." Ranger shifted closer, resting his head on Caleb's boot. The old dog's eyes reflected the fire's glow, faithful, eternal, unspoken. Caleb reached down, scratching behind his ears. "You did good, boy," he whispered. "You found us all." The fire burned low as the three of them, man, woman, and child, stood wrapped in the quiet rhythm of their new life. The wind that once howled now only carried the scent of pine and warmth. Above them, the northern stars shimmered like witnesses. And in that golden silence of spring, beneath a sky reborn, the story that had begun in blizzard and loss found its ending, not in rescue, but in belonging. Tom Tat Ting Viet. Sometimes miracles don't arrive with thunder or angels. They come quietly, through the hearts of those who choose to stay when the world walks away. In a frozen town called Duluth, a soldier, a mother, and an old dog proved that faith still breathes even in the coldest winters. Because when love protects, when forgiveness heals, and when courage stands guard over the weak, that is God's work. It may not always look like lightning from the sky, but it feels like warmth after a storm. If you believe that God still works through ordinary people, share this story with someone who needs hope today. Comment Amen if you believe that every act of kindness is a small miracle.
And don't forget to subscribe for more stories where faith, love, and courage light the darkest nights.
May the Lord bless you, protect your home, and remind you, no matter how fierce the storm, He always sends help in fur, flesh, or faith.